to China, where the Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year.
When China began its strange desert experiment, few believed it could work. The land was dry, the winds brutal, the soil lifeless. Planting trees there seemed foolish.
We have doubts about the possibility, the viability of this idea.
But while the critics mocked, the country kept going. Years passed, and something incredible began to appear on the horizon. The transformation would silence every doubt. You will soon understand why this project changed everything. The sand that threatened a nation. In the north of China, there was a time when the land itself seemed to be vanishing. Villages were swallowed by waves of dust. Rivers turned shallow, and fields that once grew wheat became barren plains. The world watched as China battled something far greater than pollution or overpopulation. It was fighting the desert, and few believed the country could win. For years, the sands had been moving slowly, but relentlessly. What started as dry patches in faraway provinces grew into a national emergency by the end of the 20th century. Entire regions were being consumed by desertification. It was more than an environmental issue. It was a threat to food security, health, and even the country's stability. The causes ran deep. In the rush to modernize after 1949, China pushed its land to the limit. Forests were cleared to feed the demand for wood. On the other hand, overgrazing stripped away grasslands. Farmers tilled the same soil until it lost its strength. With every passing year, the ground grew weaker. When the protective cover of plants vanished, strong northern winds began to lift away the topsoil. By the year 2000, nearly one-third of China's land had been lost to desertification. The Gobi Desert alone was growing by more than 1,000 square miles each year. The Taklamakan Desert, often called the Sea of Death, was the greatest threat of all. Its vast, shifting dunes had already erased ancient trade routes centuries ago. And now, it was creeping eastward again. Entire towns stood on the edge of disappearance. The damage wasn't just seen, it was felt. Sandstorms rolled through cities like Beijing and Tianjin, darkening the sky in broad daylight. In 2006, China recorded 17 major sandstorms. The clouds of dust were so large they reached as far as Japan and even the western coast of the United States. The toll on human life was immense. Crops withered and water sources dried up. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Some became known as ecological migrants. These were citizens driven out not by war or poverty, but by the collapse of their own environment. For a country rising as a global power, the stakes were higher than survival. China's image of progress was being buried under layers of sand. Leaders knew that short-term fixes would fail. What was needed was a plan as vast and ambitious as the desert itself. That plan would come to be known as the Great Green Wall. It was a project so enormous that many laughed at the idea. Yet in the face of doubt, China chose to fight back, not with weapons, but with roots and leaves. What followed next would test human endurance and reshape the very heart of the desert. China's living wall. In 1978, a plan unlike any other was set in motion. It was called the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, better known today as the Great Green Wall. The plan was nothing short of revolutionary, to build a living barrier of trees stretching across the country's arid north, where the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts were advancing like restless seas. The barrier would be 2,800 miles long and 900 miles wide. It would cover regions of Dongbei in the northeast, Hubei in the north, and Xibei in the northwest. The idea was to bring life back to land that had turned to dust. But what made this effort extraordinary was not just its size. It was how deeply it involved the entire nation. Every level of government took part, including local officials and central planners in Beijing. People across the country were called to join in. Schools, factories, and even soldiers were assigned tree-planting duties. For many, it was not just work, but a shared mission of survival. The plan was divided into 8 stages, spanning 73 years, from 1978 to 2050. By its end, it aimed to restore more than 35 million hectares of degraded land. To make it possible, China introduced the Grain for Green program in 1999. Farmers who agreed to stop using their overworked farmland were compensated with food and money in exchange for turning their plots into grassland or forest. This was China's boldest gamble yet. It was a fight to turn the tide of nature itself. But would it work? Could a wall made of trees really stand against the might of the desert? from barren ground to blooming plains. Something remarkable began to take shape across northern China, though few believed it would last. What started as a desperate fight against encroaching sands was now evolving into a national mission. In 1981, the country declared March 12th as National Tree Planting Day. It was a move that transformed a government project into a patriotic duty. Millions joined in, planting saplings across the dry northern plains. This massive participation drew inspiration from Sun Yat-sen. He had advocated for large-scale afforestation before his death on the same date in 1925. His vision lived on through the movement, and it created a sense of purpose that reached far beyond the act of planting trees. But transforming deserts into forests was no simple task. As a result, the government turned to science. Scientists began leading extensive studies. They used satellite monitoring to track forest growth and assess the survival rates of trees. The data they collected shaped new methods of land recovery. Each region faced its own challenges, especially in the harsh, dry northern zones where many plants failed to take root. But failure never halted the effort. Farmers experimented with irrigation systems, straw checkerboards, and soil conditioners to lock moisture in place. Over time, the project expanded beyond just trees. Grasslands were restored, shrubs were planted, and crops resistant to desert conditions began to flourish. This diverse mix made the environment more stable, protecting the land from turning barren again. By the early 2000s, images taken from above showed patches of green spreading where only dust had once been. Inner Mongolia and Shanxi were beginning to recover. There were setbacks, of course. Some trees died, and experts doubted the effort could last. Yet, despite the failures, a quiet sense of pride spread across the nation. The Great Green Wall was growing, and it was far from finished. The desert that would not yield. At first, the world could hardly take China's desert plan seriously. The idea of planting trees in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth sounded almost absurd. Could forests really survive in places where rain barely touched the soil and summer winds were unrelenting? Many experts said no. During the early years, that doubt seemed justified. By the late 1980s, satellite images showed vast areas of lifeless ground where rows of young trees had once stood. Entire plantations vanished under shifting dunes, and they left behind what many called ghost forests. In some regions, more than half of the trees had died. Others reported that 8 out of every 10 never made it through a single season. For a project of this size, those numbers were crushing. Environmental scientists grew louder in their criticism. They warned that China was planting the wrong kind of trees, ones not suited for dry and salty soil. Poplars and pines, which were popular choices at first, could not survive without constant watering and nutrients. Without biodiversity, these monocultures became breeding grounds for disease and pests. Instead of healing the land, experts feared the campaign might be making things worse. There were also concerns about water. Some researchers pointed out that large-scale planting was pulling precious moisture away from nearby farmlands and rivers. Could the same trees meant to stop desertification be slowly drying out the land around them? The question created new tension, both within China and abroad. Outside the country, the project became a target for ridicule. Foreign journalists called it a grand illusion, something done more for image than impact. Headlines labeled it "Green Theater," claiming China was staging an environmental show that looked impressive but delivered little. Western think tanks questioned the spending, calling it wasteful. Others mocked it as burying money in the sand, a phrase that quickly spread. Even at home, not everyone agreed with the direction the campaign was taking. Local scientists voiced frustration over how progress was measured. Success was often judged by how many trees were planted, rather than how many survived. In some provinces, farmers complained that forced planting diverted labor from agriculture. Yet despite the arguments, the government refused to abandon the project. Instead of retreating, China adjusted its approach. New teams of ecologists and engineers were sent to monitor the land more closely. They studied which regions needed grass instead of trees, and where shrubs could thrive better than forests. The strategy was evolving, and so was the attitude behind it. It was no longer just about planting. It was about understanding. Over time, this shift in mindset would transform the Great Green Wall from a struggling idea into a system that adapted, learned, and grew stronger with each passing year. The world had mocked the effort once. Soon, those same critics would have to look again and wonder how something once dismissed as impossible was beginning to take root. Grids of hope. While the world mocked the country's idea of building forests in sand, thousands of workers, engineers, and volunteers quietly pushed forward. There were no fancy machines, no billion-dollar programs, only sweat, grit, and a determination that refused to die. They were not fighting enemies or armies. They were fighting the wind. One of their cleverest ideas came from a few desert researchers in the 1970s. They created what became known as the straw checkerboard method. It was a simple but powerful invention. Workers laid bundles of straw across the dunes in small square grids. The straw slowed the wind and kept sand from drifting. In addition, it also held bits of moisture long enough for new plants to grow. It did not look like much at first, just a patchwork of dry straw on endless dunes. However, it became the difference between survival and failure. The straw came from rice farms scattered across the country. China produced hundreds of millions of tons of leftover rice straw every year, and most of it was burned or dumped. Now it had a new purpose. Truckloads were hauled into the desert. Men and women spread them by hand under the sun with their faces covered with cloth to block the sand. They worked around the edges of the Taklamakan Desert. It was a place so dry that sand could bury roads overnight and swallow nearby villages without warning. Every square meter took effort. Each grid had to be fixed into the ground and watered so it would not blow away. The goal was not to conquer the desert in a day, but to slow it down just enough for life to gain a foothold. At the same time, the National Tree Planting Day movement was sweeping across the country. Between 1982 and 2021, over 78 billion trees were planted by volunteers alone. But the process was not easy. The soil was hard and dry, sometimes too salty for plants to survive. Workers dug through it with basic tools. Water had to be brought in by tanker trucks. Some built small irrigation trenches by hand, guiding what little water they had toward newly planted saplings. To make the soil richer, they mixed in compost and clay to help it hold water longer. It was backbreaking work. Some days ended with barely a sign of progress. The heat could be brutal, and the sand never stopped moving. Even so, the straw grids began to show results. Satellite images later revealed that sand movement in certain areas had dropped by nearly 100%. Vegetation began to stick. Green patches appeared where there had once been nothing but dust. Yet, as the dunes fell silent and new shoots emerged, another problem was waiting just over the horizon. The desert had not been defeated, only slowed. Many of the trees planted still struggled to survive. The harsh winds returned, and the critics who once laughed began to ask if all this effort could truly last. The next stage of the project would test China's patience like never before. The Green Dream under fire. What began as China's great environmental mission soon turned into a war against nature itself. Every effort to plant and grow came face to face with an enemy that had ruled the land for centuries. The deserts China sought to conquer were not lifeless fields of sand. They were restless, changing landscapes shaped by fierce winds, drought, and time. The Taklamakan, the Gobi, and the other vast deserts were some of the harshest places on Earth. Rain barely fell, often less than 10 millimeters in a whole year. In some places, months passed without a single drop. Summers could burn at 45 degrees Celsius, and winters could freeze at 20 degrees below zero. How could young trees survive that? As mentioned before, many never did. The ground itself made things worse. It was loose and dry, filled with sand that slipped through the fingers like dust. It could not hold water or nutrients. Even when workers managed to bring in irrigation, most of the water disappeared almost instantly, either soaked too deep or evaporated under the sun. In the worst parts of the desert, more than 80% of planted trees died before their roots could settle. Then came the other problems, which were those created by humans. The operation needed enormous effort, and the logistics were brutal. Water, seedlings, and rice straw had to be hauled over long distances into areas far from any city. Transporting those materials cost huge amounts of money and manpower, and when sandstorms struck, they erased months of work in a few hours. Newly planted trees were buried, trenches disappeared, and entire grids of straw were blown away. Forest farms that once looked promising began to shut down. Local governments under pressure to meet planting targets focused on numbers rather than results. It was easier to count saplings than to ensure their survival. Some regions planted vast rows of the same kind of tree just to meet quotas. The land became full of identical forests with little variety. Soon, criticism started to spread. Chinese news outlets questioned whether the plan was truly working. Foreign journalists repeated their doubts, calling it a grand but misguided experiment. Environmentalists warned that the constant planting of single-species trees could create more harm than good. They argued that using so much water to keep those forests alive could dry up wells and rivers, leaving nearby farms and villages in danger. Even scientists within China began to speak up. In research papers and policy meetings, they questioned whether it was wise to keep forcing trees into a place that had never been meant for them. Some said that the goal should not be to cover deserts with forests, but to find balance. This, they said, required working with the land instead of against it. The criticism hurt, but it also forced change. Those who led the project began to realize that winning the fight against the desert would take more than trees. It would take understanding, adaptation, and time. A new phase for China's desert battle. After years of hardship and public criticism, China's Great Green Wall was entering a new stage. The dead saplings, the failed farms, and the wasted effort had all revealed one truth. And this was that the desert could not be conquered by planting alone. Policymakers and scientists began to rethink their methods. In 2011, a major report from the Chinese Academy of Sciences urged the country to change direction. It called for a shift from endless tree planting to restoring natural ecosystems. The idea was no longer to fight the desert, but to bring back balance. This report became a turning point, and soon China's desertification control programs began to evolve. Instead of retreating, the government responded with a new wave of research and experimentation. They studied the land, the soil, and the plants that could survive there. Traditional ecological knowledge was combined with modern engineering to find better answers. This marked the birth of a smarter, more adaptive phase for the Great Green Wall. The change was visible in the field. One of the most important advancements came through the mechanization of straw grid construction. In the early years, these straw grids had been laid by hand. Workers labored under the burning sun as they built the squares that helped to trap sand and retain moisture. It worked, but the process was painfully slow and labor-intensive. Chinese engineers began to design machines that could do this faster. Automated trench digging and straw-laying equipment soon appeared, capable of covering land up to 6 times quicker than manual work. This breakthrough made it possible to stabilize dunes on a much larger scale, turning once impossible areas into controlled zones where vegetation could grow. The failures of the past had turned into lessons. Instead of forcing trees to grow where they could not, China began to use engineering, science, and nature together. How science rebuilt the desert. The transformation went beyond machines and manpower, a wave of ecological refinement that reshaped everything China thought it knew about fighting the desert. After years of planting trees that couldn't survive, scientists realized that the problem wasn't just the method, it was the kind of trees being used. The old reliance on fast-growing species had failed. They were too fragile, too thirsty, and never truly belonged in the desert. So, China changed course. Instead of forcing unsuitable trees into the sand, attention shifted to native and desert-adapted species. Plants such as saxaul, goji, and hardy desert grasses began to appear across the dunes. These species could survive the long dry seasons, anchoring the soil and restoring natural balance. They didn't just stand against the wind, they helped shape entire ecosystems that could sustain themselves. But the change wasn't only about plants. China's researchers turned their focus underground. The desert's biggest weakness was its soil. As a result, they began to experiment with ways to make it stronger. They tested mixtures of biochar, organic compost, and microbial inoculants, each designed to help sand hold moisture and nutrients. In some regions, small-scale drip irrigation systems were set up which helped in delivering water precisely where it was needed. In others, scientists added mycorrhizal fungi to the soil, strengthening plant roots and increasing survival rates. At the same time, engineering merged with ecology in impressive new ways. The Bao-Tu-Lanzhou Railway, which cut through a section of the Tengger Desert, became a model of environmental design. Instead of fighting the sand directly, engineers used straw checkerboards, gravel belts, and windbreak forests to shield the railway from burial. The same strategy was later used for a new high-speed highway across the Taklamakan, one of the world's most hostile deserts, long thought impossible to build through. These methods were not about covering land with trees, but about redesigning the desert itself to support life. Strategic corridors of vegetation were laid between dunes to slow the wind, trap dust, and prevent erosion. Satellites and drones monitored the progress and sent real-time data which allowed teams to adjust their strategies as conditions changed. Through persistence, trial, and error, a more balanced approach emerged. The desert that once seemed lifeless was beginning to breathe again. Within 10 years, the transformation became visible from space, and nations that once doubted China's efforts began to take notice. The desert was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was becoming proof that patience and science could turn even the harshest landscapes into living ground. the desert that bloomed. By the year 2024, China had achieved something that few believed was possible. A green belt of nearly 1,800 miles now wrapped around the Taklamakan Desert, and it transformed one of the planet's harshest landscapes into a living shield of trees, grass, and soil. Once, the wind carried sand that buried roads and villages. Now, it carried the scent of new growth and damp earth. The change did not come overnight. Years of planning and failures had shaped what stood there today. Between 2016 and 2020, more than 21 million acres of lifeless desert were turned into green zones. By 2024, the total area reforested had crossed 30 million hectares, lifting the nation's forest coverage from 10% in 1949 to more than 25%. Those numbers carried more than just pride. They told of survival, persistence, and innovation on a massive scale. Across Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, and Xinjiang, once known for violent dust storms, the skies had grown calmer. Cities that used to be hidden under yellow haze during spring now saw clear horizons. For the first time in decades, residents could open their windows without tasting sand in the air. The proof of success could be seen from above. Satellite images captured thick ribbons of green stretching across the desert, a pattern so distinct that global researchers began studying it. Areas that had once looked lifeless now appeared alive with lines of vegetation, protecting farms, highways, and homes. The transformation was so complete that the Baotou-Lanzhou Railway, once at risk of being buried, was still fully operational. Its tracks were now guarded by layers of straw grids, gravel, and forest belts. Even the high-speed highway through the Taklamakan, once written off as impossible, had become a functioning route. But beyond the science and engineering, the desert was turning into an opportunity. Regions that once could not support life began to attract visitors. Ecotourists came to see what many called the green miracle local communities adapted to. Farmers began cultivating goji berries, desert herbs, and grapes in places where sand once ruled. For many, this shift meant not only cleaner air, but also a chance at prosperity. Jobs were created, poverty began to fall, and hope returned to communities that had long been forgotten. The world began to take notice. Nations struggling with their own dry lands sent experts to study China's model. Environmental groups that once doubted the project's long-term success were forced to acknowledge what had been achieved. China was no longer the student, it had become the example. What began as a desperate attempt to stop the sands had evolved into one of the greatest environmental recoveries of the modern era. A green miracle. No one believed that burying plants in the desert would change anything. But 2 decades later, the same deserts that once mocked human ambition are now covered in forests that stretch beyond the horizon. China's fight against desertification, once seen as an impossible mission, has evolved into one of the greatest environmental turnarounds in modern history. What started as a local experiment has now captured the attention of the entire world. From the year 2000 to 2017, NASA satellites began to notice something strange. Despite massive deforestation in other parts of the planet, the world was getting greener. A detailed study released in 2019 revealed that China alone was responsible for nearly a quarter of the total increase in global green cover. The findings surprised scientists. Much of this growth came not from natural forests, but from deliberate reforestation and sustainable land restoration projects led by China. The Great Green Wall, combined with other major planting campaigns, became the backbone of this movement. The sand that once traveled hundreds of miles to choke northern cities began to settle. Wind erosion weakened. The air grew cleaner. Agriculture flourished again in places that had been abandoned for decades. These ecological victories went beyond appearance. As vegetation returned, the land began to trap carbon dioxide, and this allowed China to offset part of its emissions and improve its environmental standing. Scientists also recorded fewer dust storms and fewer hospital visits for respiratory illness. In addition, there was also the re-emergence of small birds and mammals. Every patch of green meant a new microhabitat taking shape where there had once been nothing. But perhaps the most unexpected part of this transformation came from outside China. Countries battling their own deserts started paying close attention. From the Sahel in Africa to parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, leaders began reaching out to Chinese experts for help. The low-cost techniques used in China, such as straw grids, drought-tolerant trees, and local community participation, were now being studied for replication. African Union officials even invited Chinese specialists to share insights for the Great Green Wall Initiative. Inside China, the project became a source of national pride. Media outlets showcased before and after images that seemed almost unbelievable. Entire regions once written off as lost were now alive again, covered with plants, wildlife, and human activity. Desert-grown products such as goji berries, herbs, and grapes became valuable exports. What was once a campaign to stop sand had evolved into a thriving economy rooted in sustainability. The real power behind this transformation lies in how China combined ancient techniques with modern science. Traditional water-saving methods merged with satellite monitoring and machine-assisted planting. Villagers worked side by side with engineers, planting trees that could withstand both heat and drought. It was not a single miracle, but a steady effort carried out by millions over decades. In the end, what the world once mocked became a global inspiration. The desert had not been defeated. It had been taught how to live again. And as nations continue to face climate challenges, China's experience stands as a living lesson that even the most unforgiving landscapes can be reborn through patience, science, and willpower. If you found China's desert transformation as fascinating as we did, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories that change the way we see our world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.